a Hollywood mansion, unimaginable wealth, a homeless corpse rotting on a stranger's filthy sofa. Glenn Quinn didn't just fall from star to junkie, he was exterminated by heroin in plain sight. While his face was on television generating millions for corporate executives, his dead body lay penniless, unable to afford a basic pine coffin. How does a golden boy who spent a fortune saving his friends from addiction end up dying alone with a needle in his arm, discarded like human trash by the city that worshipped him? Long before the predatory casting rooms of Burbank, the geography of his destruction began in the damp, gray streets of Cabinteely. Glenn Martin Christopher Quinn was born on May 28, 1970, in Dublin, Ireland. The Dublin of the 1970s and 80s was a city of stark economic realities, defined by high unemployment and a pervasive sense of limited horizons. It was a working-class environment that bred a specific type of resilience. Glenn was not born into the lineage of Hollywood royalty. He was not groomed for the camera from infancy, nor was he shielded by the protective bubble of wealth. Growing up in this working-class neighborhood, he was a boy with a natural, kinetic energy and a deep, inherent musicality. He played the drums, he played the guitar, and he possessed the legendary Irish charm, a survival mechanism designed to disarm, entertain, and connect. He learned early on how to read a room, how to adjust his frequency to match the people around him, a skill that is indistinguishable from the art of acting. In 1988, as the economic engine of Ireland sputtered, a teenage Glenn and his mother made the monumental decision to emigrate. They packed their lives into suitcases and crossed the Atlantic, chasing the gravitational pull of the American economy. They did not land in the manicured enclaves of Beverly Hills. They settled in Long Beach, California. The culture shock was absolute. The wet, historical melancholy of Dublin was instantly replaced by the relentless baking sun and the sprawling concrete indifference of Southern California. Glenn was an 18-year-old immigrant possessing a thick Irish brogue and absolutely zero connections in the most exclusionary industry on the planet. He did not step off the plane and onto a red carpet. He stepped into the grueling, anonymous labor force that keeps the city functioning. He painted houses. He waited tables. He stood on his feet for hours, watching the wealthy denizens of Los Angeles consume the lifestyle he was serving them. But Glenn was driven by a hunger that only those who have crossed an ocean with nothing can truly understand. He began to navigate the brutal, soul-crushing circuit of Hollywood auditions. Glenn entered these rooms carrying a secret weapon, his authenticity. While the other young actors from Orange County or the San Fernando Valley were desperately trying to manufacture an aura of working-class grit, Glenn actually possessed it. He knew what it felt like to be broke. He knew the anxiety of the immigrant hustle. He didn't have to act the part of the hungry outsider. He was the hungry outsider. He also possessed a remarkable, almost terrifying talent for mimicry. Recognizing that his thick Dublin accent was a liability in the American television market, which demanded homogenization, he systematically erased his own voice. He studied the flat regional cadence of the American Midwest and the casual drawl of California. He trained his vocal cords to hide his origins so effectively that casting directors assumed he was just another local kid. He was actively dismantling his own identity to become a blank slate onto which the industry could project its desires. Erasing his own voice to become a marketable product was his first quiet trauma in Hollywood. His breakthrough did not happen overnight. There were small, forgettable roles, commercials, and pilots that never saw the light of day. But his undeniable physical beauty and that underlying dangerous energy began to catch the attention of the gatekeepers. In 1990, the producers of Roseanne were faced with a narrative problem. The show was a massive hit, but the teenage characters were growing up and the storylines needed to evolve to maintain the viewership of the coveted 18 to 34 demographic. The character of Becky Connor, the bright, ambitious daughter, needed a foil. She needed a boyfriend who would infuriate her parents, a character who represented the ultimate nightmare for a working-class father, a charming motorcycle-riding high school dropout with no prospects but a surplus of confidence. They needed the archetype of the bad boy. When Glenn Quinn walked into the audition room for the role of Mark Healy, the search ended. He delivered the lines with a perfect flat American accent, but his eyes carried the mischievous, defiant spark of a Dublin street kid. He hit the exact impossible balance the network demanded. He was threatening enough to create dramatic conflict within the television family, but charismatic enough that the audience would forgive him. He was a safe manifestation of danger. The producers did not just hire an actor that day, they purchased a highly effective demographic magnet. The transition was violently abrupt. The young man who had been painting houses in Long Beach was suddenly thrust onto the sound stage of the biggest television show on the planet. The schedule of a network sitcom is a relentless industrial grind. It is a factory that produces 22 minutes of laughter every single week. Monday is the table read. Tuesday and Wednesday are rehearsals where the script is constantly rewritten. Thursday is camera blocking, and Friday is the shoot in front of a live screaming studio audience. There is no time for artistic exploration or deep psychological preparation. You are given a mark to hit, a joke to land, and a lighting cue to catch. You are a cog in a multi-million-dollar machine, and your sole purpose is to keep the machine running efficiently. For Glenn, the pressure was astronomical. He was surrounded by seasoned heavyweight veterans like John Goodman and Roseanne Barr, actors who possessed massive gravitational pulls and commanded the set. Glenn had to stand toe-to-toe with them, projecting an unshakable confidence, while internally navigating the terrifying reality that he could be fired and replaced at any moment if the audience didn't respond to him. But the audience did respond. The reaction to Mark Healy was immediate and explosive. The network executives watched the focus group numbers and the fan mail pour in, and they realized they had struck gold. Glenn's initial brief guest starring arc was rapidly expanded. He was woven into the permanent fabric of the show. With the permanence came the reward. The financial compensation for a series regular on a #1 network sitcom in the 1990s is difficult to comprehend in the modern fragmented streaming era. The checks that began to arrive in Glenn's mailbox were staggering. The economic anxiety of his immigrant past was obliterated in a matter of months, replaced by a flood of capital. He was no longer a wage laborer. He was a highly compensated corporate asset. But sudden wealth, especially for someone who has never possessed it, is not merely a solution to problems. It is a violent disruption of reality. It alters the fundamental architecture of a person's life. Glenn Quinn, in his early 20s, found himself at the dead center of this intoxicating, toxic bubble. He purchased the requisite sprawling home in the Hollywood Hills, the physical manifestation of his victory over the casting system. He looked down upon the grid of Los Angeles, a city he had conquered through sheer charisma and an expertly crafted American accent. But the view from the top of the Hollywood Hills is notoriously isolating. You are physically elevated above the ordinary world, separated from the grounding realities of daily struggle. The air is thinner, and the silence in a massive, empty house can be deafening. The character of Mark Healey became both his savior and his prison. Everywhere he went, the public did not see Glenn, the complex, sensitive Irishman who loved music and worried about his family. They saw Mark. They demanded the smirk. They expected the bad boy. The psychological toll of this constant public performance is profound. When the world rewards you exclusively for a fictional version of yourself, the authentic self begins to starve. You become a hostage to your own merchandise. You must maintain the illusion of the carefree, rebellious heartthrob even when you are exhausted, terrified, or deeply lonely. The dissonance between the internal reality of the human being and the external demands of the television network creates a psychological vacuum, a hollow space that desperately demands to be filled. And in Los Angeles in the 1990s, there was a vast, booming industry dedicated exclusively to filling the hollow spaces of the rich and famous with chemicals that promised a temporary artificial peace. The stage was set, the wealth was accumulated, the isolation was complete. The machine had built the perfect idol, completely unaware that it had also built the perfect target for a chemical predator that was quietly waiting in the shadows of the Hollywood Hills. The illusion of control is the most dangerous narcotic available to a newly minted celebrity, and in the mid-1990s, Glenn Quinn appeared to be in absolute command of his universe. As the ratings for Roseanne continued to dominate the television landscape, his character Mark Healey transitioned from a mere plot device into a cultural fixture. He was no longer just the rebellious boyfriend. He was an integral pillar of the Connor family dynamic. With this elevated status came a level of financial compensation that fundamentally alters the reality of a young man who had arrived in America with little more than a suitcase and an Irish accent. The network television model of that era was a license to print money, and the actors who anchored these massive hits were compensated with staggering weekly salaries, syndication residuals, and signing bonuses. Glenn was suddenly navigating a world where the financial anxieties of his working-class Dublin youth were completely eradicated. He could buy whatever he wanted, travel wherever he pleased, and gain access to rooms that were permanently locked to the general public. He had achieved the Hollywood dream in its most pristine, highly lucrative form. To exercise this newly acquired power, and perhaps to create a sanctuary away from the sanitized, brightly lit sound stages of network television, Glenn channeled his wealth into the epicenter of Los Angeles nightlife. He became the co-owner of Goldfinger's, a nightclub situated in the heart of Hollywood. This was not merely a passive investment, it was the creation of a kingdom. Goldfinger's was meticulously designed around a 1960s James Bond aesthetic, dripping with retro glamour, velvet-draped VIP sections, and an atmosphere of exclusive, sophisticated danger. In the mid to late 90s, before the pervasive surveillance of smartphone cameras and social media, the Hollywood nightclub scene was a wild, unregulated frontier where the elite could engage in spectacular excess behind closed doors. Goldfinger's quickly became the absolute nexus of this scene. It was the place where A-list movie stars, touring rock musicians, fashion models, and industry power brokers converged after midnight. At the center of this swirling, intoxicating chaos was Glenn. He was the ultimate proprietor, holding court in his own establishment with a magnetic, effortless charm. He would navigate the crowded, thumping rooms of Goldfinger's, a martini in hand, flashing the smile that made him famous, seamlessly transitioning from conversations with studio executives to shots with underground rock bands. Owning a successful nightclub is a specific type of power trip. It provides the illusion that you are the orchestrator of the city's pulse. You decide who crosses the velvet rope, you control the flow of the alcohol, and you dictate the soundtrack of the night. For a young man still processing his rapid ascent to global fame, Goldfingers offered a nightly validation of his status. He was not just an employee of a television network reading lines written by someone else. He was the boss. He was the architect of the coolest room in California. However, the environment of a high-end Hollywood nightclub is also an incubator for the darkest, most destructive elements of the entertainment industry. When you are the king of the nightlife, you are surrounded by a court of sycophants, enablers, and individuals whose sole currency is proximity to fame and access to illicit substances. The boundaries between professional hospitality and personal consumption begin to blur. Yet, what makes the tragedy of Glenn Quinn so profoundly heartbreaking is the stark, jagged contrast between the perilous environment he inhabited and the astonishing purity of his own heart. The history of Hollywood is littered with arrogant, self-serving stars who use their power to exploit those beneath them. Glenn was the exact opposite. Beneath the leather jacket of Mark Healy and the sophisticated swagger of the nightclub owner beat the heart of a fiercely loyal, deeply empathetic Irish working-class boy who believed that wealth was only useful if it could be used to protect the people he loved. This intrinsic generosity manifested in ways that were entirely divorced from the performative philanthropy often seen in the entertainment industry. Glenn did not donate to charity for tax write-offs or public relations photo opportunities. His generosity was quiet, immediate, and fiercely personal. He was known among his inner circle as the one who would pick up the tab, offer his home, and fiercely protect his friends when the industry's darker elements threatened to consume them. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He actively threw financial lifelines to those drowning in the same chemical undertow he would eventually succumb to. This protective instinct extended far beyond his immediate circle of adult friends. It was perhaps most visibly and touchingly demonstrated on the notoriously high-pressure set of Roseanne. The environment of a top-rated sitcom is not a playground. It is a multi-million-dollar corporate battlefield, fraught with network interference, shifting scripts, and the massive, often volatile personalities of the adult cast members. For a child actor, stepping onto that soundstage is akin to walking into a psychological minefield. Michael Fishman, who played the youngest Connor child, DJ, was thrust into this adult world at a highly impressionable age. He was surrounded by the machinery of fame, a system that frequently devours child actors, leaving them traumatized and discarded when they outgrow their demographic utility. Glenn recognized the vulnerability of the young boy and instinctively positioned himself as a human shield. He did not treat Michael as a mere prop or a nuisance. He treated him as a younger brother who needed guidance through a very dangerous landscape. During the long, tedious hours of downtime between lighting setups and camera blocking, Glenn would pull Michael into his dressing room. Away from the screaming producers and the glare of the studio lights, Glenn taught the boy how to play the guitar. He shared his love of music, providing a creative grounding outlet that had nothing to do with television ratings or network executives. More importantly, he dispensed blunt, honest advice about the treacherous nature of the industry they were both employed by. He warned Michael about the sycophants, the financial traps, and the ephemeral nature of fame. He was actively trying to equip the child with the psychological armor necessary to survive Hollywood intact. Sitting in a dressing room, patiently teaching a child how to strum a chord while warning him about the dangers of the entertainment machine, Glenn offered a quiet sanctuary away from the glaring studio lights, fiercely shielding others from a darkness he was quietly succumbing to. The man acting as a lifeguard for a child star, dispensing survival tactics and throwing financial lifelines to drowning friends, was already stepping off the edge of the cliff himself. For Glenn, the pressure to maintain the dual facades of his life was becoming a crushing psychological burden. On one side, he had to sustain the illusion of Mark Healey, delivering comedic timing and manufactured rebellion to millions of viewers every week. On the other side, he had to play the role of the infallible nightclub kingpin, projecting endless energy, wealth, and sophisticated cool at Goldfinger's. Beneath both of these heavy, exhausting masks was the immigrant kid from Dublin, grappling with the imposter syndrome that inevitably plagues those who achieve sudden, astronomical success far from home. The cognitive dissonance between his internal anxieties and his external responsibilities created a screaming void in his chest. Heroin does not introduce itself as a destroyer of worlds. It introduces itself as a whisper, a temporary vacation from the relentless demands of your own mind. It is highly probable that Glenn's initial encounters with the drug were casual, hidden behind the closed doors of exclusive parties, perceived as just another indulgence available to a wealthy young star. In the early stages of opiate use, the addict is often highly functional. They experience the profound artificial peace the drug provides, and they mistakenly believe they have discovered a cheat code for managing stress. Glenn continued to show up to the Roseanne set. He continued to hit his marks, deliver his lines, and charm the audiences. He continued to host the glittering crowds at Goldfinger's. He believed, as all addicts initially do, that he was the exception to the rule, that his willpower, his wealth, and his intellect could domesticate the chemical. Glenn was pouring his energy into protecting his co-stars, saving his friends, and managing his businesses, completely unaware that the foundation of his own life was being quietly eaten away by termites. The generosity that defined his spirit was becoming a camouflage for his secret deterioration. He was the strongest man in the room, holding up the walls for everyone else, while the floor beneath his own feet was silently turning to ash. The golden era of his life, defined by mansions, luxury cars, and primetime television dominance, was secretly entering its twilight. When a television show runs for nearly a decade, it ceases to be merely a place of employment. It becomes an entire ecosystem, a surrogate family, and a highly regimented rhythm of daily existence. For a functional addict, this kind of rigorous, externally imposed structure is often the only fragile barrier holding back the floodwaters of total chemical dependency. In May of 1997, the final episode of Roseanne aired, and the massive, well-oiled machine that had defined the entirety of Glenn Quinn's 20s abruptly ground to a halt. The studio lots were cleared, the familiar sets were dismantled, and the actors were released into the terrifying, unstructured vacuum of their own free time. When the call sheets stopped arriving, when the grueling, mandated hours of camera blocking and script rehearsals vanished, Glenn was left alone with his vast wealth and an endless expanse of empty days. Heroin, which had previously been relegated to the hidden margins of his schedule, eagerly rushed in to fill the silent void. Without the absolute necessity of waking up clear-headed to hit a mark and deliver a punchline, the boundaries surrounding his consumption dissolved entirely. The drug transitioned seamlessly from a dangerous coping mechanism into a full-time, all-consuming occupation. He was no longer an actor who occasionally used heroin to numb the pressure. He was a full-blown heroin addict who used to be an actor. The descent that followed was neither private nor graceful. It was a spectacular public unraveling orchestrated within the very walls of the empire he had helped to build. Goldfinger's, the glamorous James Bond-themed sanctuary where he had once reigned supreme as the ultimate Hollywood host, transformed rapidly into the theater of his deepest, most visceral humiliation. As the chemical hooks of the opiate dug deeper into the receptors of his brainstem, the polished, charismatic proprietor vanished, replaced by a frantic, hollow-eyed stranger. The insidious, dehumanizing nature of severe addiction is that it systematically strips away the social graces, the boundaries, and the fundamental pride that separate a functioning adult from a desperate, craving child. Glenn began to haunt the velvet-draped VIP sections of his own club, not as an owner holding court, but as a scavenger. He began to aggressively solicit his own wealthy clientele, asking for cash advances, pitching nonsensical drug-fueled business ventures, or simply begging for money to secure his next fix right there on the club floor. The environment of the nightclub, once a glittering symbol of his sophisticated success, became entirely toxic. His business partners, individuals who had invested heavily in the glamour and exclusive allure of the venue, watched in horror as their marquee attraction became a glaring, volatile liability that threatened to destroy their livelihood. The breaking point arrived with cold corporate finality, delivering a psychological blow from which he would never recover. The man who had meticulously designed the VIP experience, who had handpicked the staff and curated the aesthetic of the room, was physically barred from the premises. The bouncers, men whose paychecks were ostensibly funded by Glenn's initial investments, were instructed by management to block his entry. The reigning television heartthrob of the decade was left standing on the dirty sidewalk of Hollywood Boulevard, shivering in the California night air. Denied entry to his own nightclub, while the patrons he used to entertain drank inside. Heroin does not respect past achievements. It does not honor television ratings, and it does not care about your equity in a business. It only demands immediate, unconditional appeasement, and it will publicly strip you naked to get it. The highly public loss of Goldfinger's was merely the first major domino to fall in a rapid, devastating cascade of total financial ruin. The addiction required a constant, endlessly escalating stream of capital to stave off the agonizing, bone-crushing physical symptoms of withdrawal. The millions of dollars earned during the golden years of Roseanne were not merely spent. They were incinerated in a desperate daily bid to keep the sickness at bay. The sprawling, luxurious mansion in the Hollywood Hills was lost to the banks. The expensive luxury cars were liquidated, traded away for a fraction of their value to secure a few more days of artificial numbness. The tangible, hard-earned assets of a decade of labor evaporated, leaving behind a man who owned absolutely nothing but the clothes on his back and the terrifying, relentless chemical hunger in his blood. This total financial annihilation triggered his descent into the nomadic, profoundly degrading lifestyle of couch surfing. In the romanticized mythology of struggling artists, sleeping on a friend's sofa is framed as a temporary badge of honor, a brief character-building stop on the road to inevitable success. But for a fallen star in the suffocating grip of a lethal addiction, couch surfing is a terminal condition. It is a daily, humiliating exercise in exhausting the charity of others. Glenn moved from apartment to apartment across the sprawling grid of Los Angeles, relying on the fading memories of his past generosity to secure a few consecutive nights of shelter. He became a ghost, haunting the living rooms of his former peers, a physical burden to the very people he had once so fiercely protected and financially supported. The psychological devastation of this reality created a suffocating feedback loop of shame. That deep, paralyzing shame could only be silenced by the administration of more heroin, accelerating the very cycle that was destroying him. As his physical condition deteriorated and his desperation became impossible to ignore, the remaining inner circle of his friends and family faced an agonizing, impossible dilemma. They were forced to watch a man they deeply loved slowly commit suicide in plain sight, entirely powerless to stop the needle. Desperate to break the cycle and save his life, they turned to the prevailing addiction recovery philosophy of the era: tough love. It was a strategy born of deep affection and utter exhaustion, but executed with a brutal, clinical detachment. The theory dictates that an addict will never seek true, lasting recovery as long as they are enabled and protected from the consequences of their actions. Therefore, the support system must be entirely dismantled. The safety nets must be cut so that the addict can plummet to rock bottom, a mythical psychological floor where the pain of the addiction finally outweighs the terror of withdrawal. They stopped giving him money. They stopped returning his frantic phone calls. They point blank refused to let him sleep on their couches. They locked their doors and broke their own hearts, genuinely believing that by abandoning him to the unforgiving streets, they were forcing him to choose life. But heroin does not operate on the rational logic of tough love. When a human brain is chemically hijacked and rewired by heavy opiates, the fundamental instinct for self-preservation is completely overwritten by the biological demand for the drug. Rock bottom is not a springboard for recovery. For many severe addicts, rock bottom is simply a coffin. By severing his final fragile connections to the world of the living and the people who cared for him, the tough love approach did not shock Glenn into a miraculous sobriety. It merely removed the last physical and emotional barriers between him and the abyss. It pushed him further into the shadows of the city, isolating him in a dangerous, predatory underworld where the only currency that mattered was the drug itself. The intervention designed to save his life inadvertently signed his death warrant, leaving him entirely exposed to a disease that thrives in the dark. Yet, the Hollywood machine, for all its inherent transactional cruelty, occasionally offers a miraculous, seemingly impossible second chance. In 1999, Joss Whedon, the brilliant and highly influential creator of Buffy the Vampire Slayer, was launching a highly anticipated spin-off series centered around the brooding vampire, Angel. Whedon needed a specific character to serve as the bridge between the dark, supernatural protagonist and the vulnerable human world. He needed a character with street smarts, a deeply troubled past, and a hidden heart of gold. The character was Alan Francis Doyle, a half-human, half-demon, who received agonizing, debilitating visions from higher powers, guiding the heroes to those in desperate need of saving. It was a role that seemed almost supernaturally tailored to Glenn Quinn's specific acting talents and his internal off-screen struggles. The producers reached out into the darkness, extending a golden multi-million-dollar lifeline to a drowning man. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed as though the narrative of his life was going to miraculously correct itself. Glenn was cast as Doyle, and he was brilliant. He brought his native, melodic Irish accent to the screen, infusing the character with a weary, cynical, yet undeniably lovable charm that resonated instantly with the massive fan base. Doyle was a man constantly fighting his own darker demonic nature to do the right thing, a poignant, heartbreaking, and almost too perfect parallel to the actor portraying him. The audience embraced him immediately, thrilled to see the former sitcom star reinventing himself in a prestigious, hour-long drama. It was the ultimate comeback story, poised to redefine his career for a new millennium. But the monster in his bloodstream could not simply be written out of the script. The grueling, high-pressure environment of a one-hour network television drama demands absolute physical stamina and razor-sharp mental focus, qualities that Heroin systematically and permanently destroys. The initial optimism on the set of Angel quickly curdled into a familiar quiet panic among the cast, the crew, and the executives. Glenn's addiction manifested rapidly in the unforgiving, brightly lit reality of the soundstage. He began to show up hours late for call times, delaying incredibly expensive productions, leaving hundreds of crew members waiting and infuriating the directors. When he did manage to arrive, the devastating physical toll of his disease was impossible to conceal from the high-definition cameras. Makeup artists worked frantically, applying layers of cosmetics to cover the sickly pallor of his skin and the dark, sunken, bruised hollows beneath his eyes. He struggled mightily to memorize the complex, rapid-fire dialogue that Whedon's scripts famously demanded, requiring endless, frustrating multiple takes that stalled the momentum of the scenes. He was visibly sweating, trembling, and entirely detached from the professional rigor required to anchor a massive network franchise. The producers, who had championed his casting and genuinely wanted to see him succeed and conquer his demons, found themselves backed into a cold, corporate corner. A television show is a massive financial investment involving hundreds of jobs, and they could not jeopardize the entire enterprise for the sake of one struggling, unreliable actor, no matter how beloved he was by the fans or the cast. The decision was made with the cold, necessary, and ruthless calculus of the entertainment industry. They could not save Glenn Quinn, so they had to fire him to save the show, to manage his exit gracefully and protect the narrative of the series. The writers crafted a heroic, emotionally devastating death for his character. In the 9th episode of the first season, Doyle sacrifices his own life to save his friends and a group of innocent bystanders, willingly absorbing a lethal blast of mystical energy. It was a beautiful, tear-jerking television moment that cemented Doyle's legacy as a martyr and a hero in the fandom forever. But the reality behind the camera was a devastating, ugly tragedy. The heroic, noble death on screen was merely a public relations cover for the tragic, unceremonious termination off-screen. When the director called cut on Doyle's final sacrificial scene, the heavy iron doors to the Hollywood kingdom slammed shut on Glenn Quinn for the absolute last time. He had been handed the rarest of gifts, a legitimate, highly publicized, and lucrative comeback, and his addiction had forced him to set it on fire in front of the entire industry. The loss of the role on Angel was not just a career setback. It was the ultimate psychological death blow. It confirmed his darkest, most terrifying internal fear, that he was permanently, fundamentally broken and beyond repair. The industry had extended its hand, given him a final highly visible test, and he had failed spectacularly. As he walked off the Paramount lot for the last time, stripped of his character, his second chance, and his steady paycheck, he stepped into a permanent, inescapable darkness. He left behind the very last vestiges of the bright, shining star he had once been, and he began the final, fatal, invisible march toward a borrowed, stained sofa in the valley. The physical act of walking off a major Hollywood studio lot for the final time is a uniquely devastating experience. An invisible exile that carries no immediate fanfare but echoes with the deafening finality of a closing vault. When Glenn Quinn surrendered his security badge and stepped beyond the guarded gates after his termination from Angel, he was not merely losing a steady paycheck or a compelling character arc. He was being systematically unplugged from the life support machine of the entertainment industry. For an actor whose entire adult identity has been forged in the high-stakes, meticulously scheduled environment of network television, the sudden absence of a call sheet is not freedom. It is a terrifying, breathless freefall into an abyss of unstructured time. The Paramount lot, with its bustling golf carts, its massive humming sound stages, and its highly orchestrated hierarchy of human value, faded in his rearview mirror, replaced by the sprawling, indifferent concrete grid of Los Angeles. He had been handed the golden ticket of a career resurrection, a miraculous second act in a town that notoriously despises failure, and he had watched it disintegrate in his own trembling hands. The psychological weight of this specific failure is impossible to overstate. It was a crushing confirmation of the darkest whispers of his addiction, a brutal realization that the disease was no longer just a manageable passenger in his life. It had taken absolute control of the wheel and driven his last, best hope directly into a brick wall. The years that immediately followed his dismissal from the Buffyverse, spanning the turn of the millennium and bleeding into the early desolate years of the 2000s, constitute the darkest, most agonizing chapter of his narrative. These were the phantom years, a period characterized not by the glamorous, publicized bad boy antics of his Roseanne era, but by a quiet, desperate, and invisible grinding down of his physical and spiritual reserves. Hollywood is a town engineered with a predatory amnesia. It possesses a terrifying capacity to forget its former darlings, the exact moment they cease to be profitable or become an insurance liability. The telephone, which had once rung incessantly with offers, say, for lucrative endorsements, script readings, and exclusive party invitations, went completely dead. The high-powered agents and publicists who had once fought fiercely to represent the charismatic Irish heartthrob quietly scrubbed his name from their client rosters, distancing themselves from a sinking ship to protect their own professional buoyancy. The industry operates on a ruthless, unspoken quarantine protocol regarding severe addiction. An actor who cannot reliably hit a mark, remember a line, or pass a completion bond physical is immediately excommunicated, rendered entirely radioactive to producers and casting directors who cannot risk millions of dollars on a chemical wildcard. Glenn found himself stranded on the wrong side of this invisible quarantine line, entirely cut off from the only profession he had known since he was a teenager painting houses in Long Beach, without the anchor of a production schedule and stripped of the vast financial resources that had previously insulated him from the grim realities of his habit. The nature of his addiction underwent a terrifying mutation. It devolved from a luxurious hidden indulgence into a primal, all-consuming daily hustle for basic biological survival. The glamorous cinematic illusion of the tortured artist dabbling in narcotics evaporates instantly when the bank accounts are frozen and the mansions are foreclosed upon. Heroin is an unforgiving master that operates on a rigid, biological clock demanding its tribute with the threat of agonizing, bone-crushing physical withdrawal. To stave off the sickness, Glenn was forced to navigate the treacherous predatory underworld of the city, a landscape entirely divorced from the velvet ropes and VIP sections he had once commanded. The sheer, exhausting logistics of maintaining a severe opiate dependency without a steady income stream reduced his existence to a miserable, continuous loop of acquisition and consumption. Every waking moment was dictated by the frantic mathematics of the next fix, a degrading, humiliating cycle that systematically stripped away the final layers of his dignity, his charisma, and his fundamental sense of self. This devastating economic reality forced his migration away from the glittering, elevated altitudes of the Hollywood Hills and down into the flat, anonymous expanse of the San Fernando Valley. The valley, particularly areas like North Hollywood, serves as the gritty, unglamorous backstage of the entertainment capital, a holding pen for the aspiring, the working-class crew members, and the discarded. For Glenn, the valley became a sprawling, stucco-clad purgatory. He was entirely stripped of his accumulated assets, forced to abandon the tangible proof of his decade-long conquest of America. The luxury vehicles, the designer wardrobes, the extensive collections of guitars and musical equipment, everything was slowly liquidated, pawned, or simply left behind in the chaotic, frantic wake of his addiction. His entire material existence, a life that had once filled a mansion, was brutally condensed down to whatever he could carry in a single duffel bag as he transitioned into the terminal, nomadic lifestyle of chronic couch surfing. To couch surf as a highly recognizable former network television star is an exercise in profound, almost unbearable psychological torture. It is one thing to be an anonymous drifter falling on hard times. It is entirely another to be a man whose face is simultaneously being broadcast in syndicated reruns on television screens in the very living rooms where he is begging for a place to sleep. The cognitive dissonance is staggering. The people whose couches he occupied, a dwindling circle of exhausted acquaintances, former colleagues and fellow travelers in the margins of the industry, were constantly confronted by the ghost of Mark Healy, the vibrant, muscular, confident bad boy who lived inside their televisions, while the actual Glenn Quinn, hollowed out, prematurely aged and vibrating with the anxiety of addiction, curled up under a borrowed blanket in their real-world apartments. This inescapable juxtaposition created an atmosphere of heavy tragic pity, a suffocating dynamic that is poison to the pride of a man who was once known for his fierce, protective generosity and his effortless swagger. The exhaustion of hospitality is a universal, inevitable phenomenon in the trajectory of severe addiction. The friends who initially open their doors out of a sense of loyalty, nostalgia, or genuine concern are eventually ground down by the chaotic, destructive reality of living with an active heroin user. The lies, the missing valuables, the erratic hours, the constant low-level hum of danger that accompanies the procurement and use of illegal narcotics, these elements slowly but surely erode the foundation of even the deepest friendships. The interventions are staged, the tearful pleas are made, the boundaries are drawn, and ultimately the doors are locked. This is the brutal, unavoidable mathematics of the disease. It isolates the host until there is no one left to witness the final consumption. Glenn experienced this isolation not as a sudden abandonment, but as a slow, agonizing retreat of the world around him. He watched the people he loved, the people he had once supported financially and emotionally, pull away, driven not by a lack of love, but by a desperate need for self-preservation. He was forced to recognize that his presence had become toxic, a realization that only fueled the deep internal reservoir of shame and self-loathing that he was frantically trying to medicate. As the calendar pages turned and the year 2002 began its slow, inevitable crawl toward winter, the atmosphere surrounding Glenn grew increasingly desolate. Los Angeles, a city famous for its perpetual sunshine and its denial of seasonal decay, possesses a uniquely bleak quality during the winter months for those who are destitute. The nights grow unexpectedly cold. The Pacific marine layer settles heavily over the valley, and the relentless manufactured cheer of the approaching holiday season serves only to amplify the agonizing ache of loneliness. For an Irish immigrant, thousands of miles away from the damp, familiar embrace of his homeland, and the family who remembered him before he became a commodity, the isolation of a Los Angeles December is absolute. The holidays are a time of reflection, a period of taking inventory of one's life, and for Glenn, the inventory was a terrifying ledger of loss. He had lost his career, his fortune, his creative outlets, and the respect of his peers. He had been a king, a protector, a millionaire, and a national heartthrob, and he had traded it all for a chemical illusion that was now demanding his life as final payment. The tragic irony of his situation was compounded by his own acute self-awareness. Glenn Quinn was not a foolish or oblivious man. He was highly intelligent, deeply sensitive, and fully conscious of the astronomical height from which he had fallen. He possessed the agonizing clarity to understand exactly what he had done to his own life, but lacked the biochemical capacity to alter his trajectory. The brain of a severe opiate addict is a compromised organ, hijacked by a substance that mimics the neurotransmitters responsible for survival. To his rewired nervous system, acquiring heroin was no longer a choice or a moral failing. It was perceived with the same absolute biological urgency as the need for oxygen or water. This is the horror of the disease that the entertainment industry, with its sanitized, moralistic narratives of redemption, consistently fails to comprehend. It is a slow, agonizing surrender of free will. Glenn knew he was trapped in a burning building. He knew the exits were blocked, and he knew that the smoke was filling his lungs. Yet he was utterly powerless to stop inhaling. In the final weeks leading up to December 2002, the few remaining individuals who crossed his path reported a man who seemed entirely hollowed out, existing in a state of terminal fatigue. The charismatic spark that had once defined his screen presence was entirely extinguished. He was 32 years old, an age when most actors are entering their prime, consolidating their power and taking on their most challenging roles. Instead, Glenn appeared decades older, his body battered by the grueling, unrelenting physical toll of chronic intravenous drug use. The immune system collapses, the internal organs are heavily taxed, and the heart, constantly subjected to the extreme slowing effects of heavy depressants, becomes weakened and vulnerable. He was wandering the flat, gray streets of North Hollywood like a specter, a man who had already died in every meaningful societal sense, merely waiting for his biology to catch up with his reality. He eventually found himself seeking refuge in the modest, cramped apartment of a friend in North Hollywood, a final fragile port in a storm that had been raging for years. The physical space was entirely unremarkable, a standard-issue San Fernando Valley apartment that stood in violent, mocking contrast to the sprawling, customized architecture of the Hollywood Hills mansion he had once called home. The living room, where he dropped his meager belongings, was dominated by a simple sofa, a piece of furniture that was destined to become the final tragic stage for his life's drama. There was no glamour here, no velvet ropes, no adoring fans, and no protective studio executives. There was only the harsh fluorescent reality of poverty, the stale air of a borrowed room, and the terrifying heavy silence of a man who has run completely out of options. On the evening of December 2nd, 2002, while millions of televisions across the globe broadcasted the syndicated laughter of Roseanne, the real Glenn Quinn sat alone in a cramped, borrowed apartment in North Hollywood. The digital phantom of Mark Healy was thriving, generating revenue for network executives, while the physical, decaying reality of the man himself prepared for his final transaction. The transition from the velvet-roped VIP rooms of Goldfinger's to this anonymous, fluorescent-lit purgatory on a dilapidated sofa was now complete. The ritual of preparation for an intravenous drug user is a grim, mechanical liturgy. As Glenn prepared his final dose, there were no television cameras to capture his smirk, no studio audiences to laugh at his perfectly timed delivery, and no protective cast members to shield him from the consequences. There was only the stark, unvarnished reality of a man surrendering the last remnants of his free will to a powder. The physical act of injecting heroin is a violent intrusion into the cardiovascular system, a massive flooding of the brain's opioid receptors that completely overrides the biological instinct for survival. When the plunger was pushed, the chemical payload raced through his bloodstream. The immediate sensation is often described as a warm, heavy blanket settling over the soul, a total instantaneous erasure of physical and emotional pain. But this artificial peace was a fatal deception. As the morphine derivatives locked into his brainstem, they began to systematically dismantle the automatic, involuntary functions that keep the human machine running. The mechanics of a fatal opiate overdose are fundamentally uncinematic. The drug targets the respiratory control centers. Glenn's breathing began to slow down. As oxygen levels plummeted, his heart started to decelerate. To an outside observer, he would have simply appeared to be falling into a remarkably deep, peaceful slumber. On the morning of December 3rd, 2002, the friend who owned the apartment woke up, saw the motionless figure on the sofa, and assumed Glenn was simply sleeping off a bender. He left to run errands, unknowingly leaving a former television idol dead and alone for hours. When he returned at 11 a.m., the terrifying reality set in. He touched the cold skin and realized Quinn was gone. Paramedics rushed to the scene, but there was no need for a resuscitation. The unnatural pallor and fixed cyanotic lips confirmed the undeniable finality of death. The Hollywood machine had extracted his youth, and now its discarded star lay dead on a stranger's couch. Los Angeles police officers arrived to secure the scene, but initially failed to identify the victim. They did not see a charming television actor. They saw an anonymous addict surrounded by discarded syringes and drug paraphernalia. The scene was almost treated as just another routine overdose. When the name Glenn Quinn was confirmed, it caused a jarring disconnect. Even the police struggled to connect the confident star they saw on television with the decaying body before them. The autopsy results were brutally clear. His blood contained lethal levels of heroin. The official cause of death was recorded as an accidental drug overdose. The news reached his family across the Atlantic in Dublin, Ireland. They believed their son was safe from the world's dangers after achieving wealth and fame in America. Hearing that he died alone from an overdose on a stranger's couch was an unimaginable shock. While the family grieved, the American entertainment media reacted immediately. They ignored the systemic failures that led to his addiction. Instead, they published sensational headlines to boost ratings. His death was reduced to another dark piece of Hollywood entertainment. Investigators soon uncovered a grim financial reality. Quinn was a core cast member of a popular show that generated massive advertising revenue for a decade. He earned a high salary and co-owned a profitable nightclub in Hollywood. Yet at the time of his death, his bank balance was essentially zero. He owned no real estate and had no hidden funds. The capitalist ecosystem of the entertainment industry monetized his life, but offered no safety net during his struggle with addiction. Even as his body lay in the county morgue, networks were broadcasting reruns of his shows and making a profit. Meanwhile, he lacked the funds for a basic funeral. The network executives and producers who worked with him remained silent. None of the people who built their wealth using his talent offered financial support to his grieving family. The responsibility fell to Michael Fishman, the young actor who played his brother-in-law on the show. Fishman could not accept that his former mentor might be buried in an unmarked pauper's grave. The family in Ireland could not afford the massive cost of flying his body across the Atlantic. Facing the network's indifference, Fishman decided to appeal directly to the public for help. This was a painful decision that shattered the wealthy, perfect image of the television star. Ordinary viewers answered Fishman's plea. When the miserable truth behind the Hollywood illusion became known, small donations poured in from across America. Factory workers, mechanics, and ordinary mothers sent $5 bills and small checks. These were working-class fans who deeply connected with the rough but warm character Quinn played. Thousands of condolence letters accompanied the donations. This grassroots funding covered the complex and expensive process of returning his body to Ireland. Thanks to the public's compassion, he avoided an anonymous grave in Los Angeles. Quinn crossed the Atlantic back to his hometown over a decade after leaving with big dreams. This time, he was transported in the cold cargo hold of an airplane. There were no flashing cameras or cheering fans at the Dublin airport. Only his deeply grieving family and neighbors were there to receive him. The family completely blocked the media and any performative Hollywood memorials. They held a quiet, private Catholic funeral. As his casket was lowered into the damp Irish ground, not a single studio executive was present. He was surrounded only by people who loved him for who he was. His physical body finally rests in his homeland, but his digital phantom repeats endlessly on screens worldwide. His surviving family must endure the cruel reality of seeing his young, vibrant image whenever they turn on the television. The disconnect between his tragic final moments and his perfect on-screen smile exposes how the entertainment industry consumes people. Quinn's life serves as a permanent warning about the fragile humanity hidden behind the glamorous lights. The industry relentlessly monetized his talent and youth, then coldly turned away when he broke. His tragedy remains a stark reminder of the darkest side of Hollywood.